America's fifth president, James Monroe, was a nationalist. Although he was a Democratic Republican, the wave of post-war nationalism influenced many of his policies to have a more federalist leaning. These policies included the creation of a protective tariff and reviving the national bank in 1816. Nationalism also shaped Monroe's foreign policy, as he worked with Secretary of State John Adams to make a series of international treaties to solidify U.S. borders and U.S. presence throughout North America. Three main international treaties completed under Monroe's presidency included the Anglo-American Convention of 1818 with the British, the Adams-Onis Treaty, also known as the Florida Purchase Treaty, of 1819 with the Spanish, and the Russo-American Treaty of 1824 with the Russians. Additionally, Monroe is known for his policy regarding European involvement in the Americas, known as the Monroe Doctrine. The Anglo-American Convention of 1818 focused on the shared borders between the U.S. and Great Britain. Specifically, this treaty solidified the northern limits of the Louisiana Territory along the border with British Canada. The border was created at a line on the map called the 49th parallel, after a line of latitude, and it basically stretched from what's modern-day Minnesota over to the Rocky Mountains. This treaty provided for joint occupation of the Oregon Country, something both the U.S. and Great Britain agreed to share for the time being, without either nation really surrendering its claim to Oregon. One last provision of the Anglo-American Convention was that it allowed Americans to fish off of Newfoundland, Canada. A second treaty that was made during the period of nationalism under James Monroe was the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. This treaty ended up with Spain relinquishing its claims to Florida and its weak claims to the Oregon Country, while the U.S. gave up its weak claims on Texas. It also created a zigzag border, marking the southwestern edge of the U.S.'s Louisiana Purchase. The border between the U.S. and Spanish territory began near the modern-day border of Louisiana and Texas, and it continued northwest until the Rocky Mountains at the 42nd parallel, or line of latitude. At that point, the border went directly west to the Pacific Ocean. The Adams-Onis Treaty is sometimes called the Florida Purchase Treaty, but really, the U.S. was a lot more forceful than that title implies. Many Americans believed that Spanish Florida was destined to become part of the U.S. Americans living in western Florida, which is the modern-day bottom of Louisiana, had just overthrown Spanish rule in 1810, and then in 1812, during the War of 1812, U.S. troops seized control of the Mobile region, which is modern-day Alabama. So we were slowly chipping away at Spanish Florida territory prior to this treaty. One reason the U.S. was comfortable so boldly taking land in Florida was because the Spanish government's control over their colonies in Latin America was disintegrating. Chile, Venezuela, and Argentina had broken away from Spanish rule between 1810 and 1816, and that had drawn Spanish troops away from Florida towards other places in Latin America to put down those rebellions. So when Florida was weak and susceptible, Andrew Jackson, a military general, received permission to invade Florida to capture allegedly hostile Indians and runaway slaves. But in 1818, when Jackson swept into Spanish Florida, he very quickly executed 2 Indian chiefs, 2 British subjects that he had claimed were assisting those Indians, and he even seized several Spanish forts in the area, even though he was not authorized to do so. When word got back to D.C. about Jackson's actions, Monroe consulted with his cabinet. Jackson had clearly overstepped the limits of commission. That was not the job he had been sent to do in Florida, and most members of Monroe's cabinet were intent on disciplining Jackson. A weird exception was Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who would eventually run against Jackson in the upcoming presidential election of 1824. Adams was a nationalist, and he longed for control of the Florida territory. He saw Jackson's maneuvering as an opportunity to demand huge concessions from the Spanish, which is why the Americans were able to get such favorable treaty conditions in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. Both the Anglo-American Convention and the Adams-Onis Treaty were pretty aggressive offensive moves by American foreign diplomats. But at this point in Monroe's presidency, America was going to have to make some tough defensive foreign policy decisions. Essentially, Americans became worried that an alliance of European monarchies was forming to fight democracy around the world. And this was going to influence a major policy decision made during Monroe's second presidential term. The background to this is rooted in European history and the French Revolution. So after the French Revolution, which had lasted from roughly 1789 all the way until Napoleon was defeated finally in 1815, that left Europe exhausted. And old world monarchies, countries in Europe that were still ruled by kings and queens, were allegedly, Americans suspected, banding together to stop other democratic uprisings around the world. An alliance of European forces put down democratic rebellions in Italy in 1821 and Spain in 1823, and rumors from Europe hinted that an army of the allied European troops of various European kings, countries like Russia, Austria, Prussia, and France, were going to send powerful fleets and armies to help Spain secure her rebelling countries in Latin America. Remember, countries like Chile, Argentina, and Venezuela were trying to break away from Spanish rule from 1810 to 1816. That's what made Florida so easy for Americans to take. Remember that Americans were riding this sort of nationalistic high after the War of 1812. They were very aware and very proud of the fact that they were, in their own eyes, the world's first successful, enlightened democratic republic. So naturally, they were sympathetic to these South American colonies that are trying to break away from Spain and become democratic countries. And Americans were alarmed that European intervention to stop those rebellions could threaten their own democratic republicanism. This fear inspired Americans to, among other things, finalize their border with Russia. Now, it might not seem to make sense because we think of Russia as being in Asia and Europe, but Russia had actually claimed a significant amount of modern-day Alaska. And as early as 1821, Russia claimed that they controlled territory as far south as the 51st parallel, which is the coast of present-day British Columbia in Canada. Russia had set up trading posts even further south at around the entrance to the San Francisco Bay. And these actions by the Russians made Americans fear that they wouldn't be able to access the Pacific Ocean, which they desperately wanted access to for trade. So throughout 1823, and then finalized in early 1824, America signed the Russo-American Treaty with Russia, which fixed the southernmost boundary of Russia at 5440, which is still the present southern tip of the Alaskan Panhandle. America had settled its borders with Russian Alaska, Spanish Mexico, and British Canada, but Monroe and Adams were still pretty worried about the possibility of a European pro-monarchy military alliance interfering with American democracy. One familiar enemy that we didn't see lining up against us at this time was Britain. Surprisingly, Britain, even though they had a king, did not ally itself with these cautiously unifying monarchies of old Europe. Britain did not contribute troops in Europe to put down democratic rebellions, and they also did not contribute troops to help the Spanish put down rebellions in colonial Latin America. Now, the reason behind this for the British was, with those countries in Latin America, if they broke away from Spain and became independent, that would be very profitable for Britain. Because once they broke away from Spain, they sort of broke out of that mercantilist cycle and would be free to trade quite profitably with Britain. In fact, Britain had a pretty high financial interest in those Latin American colonies breaking away from Spain. Remember, Britain has been essentially involved in global war since 1754, and their economy really needed the benefit of new markets to trade in, and the best new markets were in America, or the Americas. So the Americans were pretty surprised when the British Foreign Secretary, a man by the name of George Canning, approached the American minister in London and suggested that the U.S. and Great Britain make an announcement. And what this British Foreign Secretary suggested was that the U.S. and Great Britain jointly announced that those two countries are not going to claim any more Latin American territory, and that the U.S. and Great Britain should issue a warning to other European countries saying that they have to reduce their influence and involvement in Latin America. Essentially, Great Britain wanted Great Britain and the U.S. to tell Europe to back off of Latin American interests. When news of Canning's offer got back to American Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, Adams was suspicious. America had fought 2 wars with Britain in the past 50 years, and still Britain was coming to America, a country with a still immature military, and was seeking an alliance protecting Latin America. Adams knew the British wanted to keep those Latin American countries independent so that they could profit off of uninhibited trade with them. Adams knew the British feared the U.S. might expand into the Caribbean, maybe into Cuba, and that in doing so the U.S. might end up restricting British trade. But Adams decided that it would be beneficial to ultimately agree to make this declaration, agree to hamper the U.S.'s own expansion, because it would keep European governments out of the Americas. And Adams knew that teaming up with Britain, the strongest military in the world, meant that the British would provide the military power to enforce such a declaration, and little would be expected of the American military. So, Adams set about persuading President Monroe to agree to the joint declaration between the U.S. and Great Britain that would not allow European countries to interfere with the Americas. The result of Adams' efforts was a declaration made in December of 1823 and known as the Monroe Doctrine. It really was just a statement. It wasn't a law or a declaration of war. It was an explanation, a message of the U.S.'s new policy. It was officially given to Congress, but it was unofficially directed at the rest of the world, especially the Spanish and the Russians. The U.S.'s primary motivations were self-interest and self-protection, and here's what, along with the British, we declared in the Monroe Doctrine. Number 1, the doctrine warned European powers against colonization in the Americas. Number 2, the doctrine warned European powers against continuing intervention in American political development, essentially saying that the Americas were no longer fair game to be colonized by Europeans, and that Europeans would not be permitted, or the U.S. would not stand by and watch European powers interfere with the democratic development of Latin American nations. In response, the Europeans were angered, but they didn't want to violate the Monroe Doctrine because it would incur the wrath of the British Royal Navy. Now, while this doctrine wasn't very significant then, the idea of the U.S. as a speaker for North and South America is revisited again later on in U.S. history. And eventually the U.S. takes on the role of a protector/guardian for North and South America at later dates.